Welcome back. Last time we talked about strength training, this time moving on to endurance training. So the way this chapter is laid out, or the way that I'm going to discuss it, is to look at some of the limitations on endurance performance, and then we'll talk about how different training intensities can affect those limitations. So for example, one of the limitations of endurance performance is your aerobic capacity, which is your ability to deliver and use oxygen. And so one of the limitations in oxygen delivery is cardiac output, which is how much blood the heart can pump per minute. And one of the training variables that we can affect there is stroke volume. So cardiac output is heart rate, how many times the heart beats per minute, times stroke volume, which is how much blood is ejected from the left ventricle of the heart with each beat. And so your maximum heart rate is something that is determined by your genetics and also determined by your age. So we can't really affect that, but we can affect stroke volume. And so if we can train intensely enough that we improve stroke volume, then we can improve oxygen delivery, then we can improve VO2 max, and hopefully by addressing that, then we can improve endurance performance. So like I said, the way this is going to be laid out is we'll talk about the different limitations on endurance performance, and then we'll talk about different training intensities that can affect those, and hopefully then improve performance. So the authors categorize endurance training into two really broad categories. So the first one that they use is low intensity endurance exercise, or LIEE. I'm pretty sure they're the only people I've ever seen use that acronym, but that's okay. So low intensity endurance exercise, I think the easiest way to conceptualize that is if somebody just goes out for a run, right? So this is fairly easy, easy in the sense that it is not uncomfortable. So it is just a pace that somebody could maintain for 30 minutes or longer. And it doesn't have to be running, right? It could be running, could be swimming, could be cycling, any number of other activities performed at a low intensity for a relatively long duration, so more than 30 minutes, and performed comfortably. So that's low intensity endurance exercise. So that forms kind of the aerobic base. When you look at endurance programs for endurance athletes, or training programs for endurance athletes, not the strength aspect, but the endurance aspect, that's the base of the training, and that takes up a majority of the training is actually the low intensity endurance exercise. So especially early, like in the general preparatory phase, the athletes are going to do almost exclusively low intensity endurance exercise, and then as they progress in the program and they get closer to cross country season or closer to their competitive swim season, for example, they're going to start to mix in more high intensity interval type stuff. But at the beginning, in that general preparatory phase, they're going to spend most of their time building what is referred to as an aerobic base by doing pretty high volume, low intensity stuff, so this low intensity endurance exercise. One of the things that the authors go to great lengths to point out is that there are a lot of sports that are not endurance sports where low intensity endurance exercise is sometimes recommended. So for example, I'll actually give you a personal example from a strength and conditioning conference I went to about 20 years ago now. And it was at a school where there were presentations from different strength and conditioning coaches, and one of the coaches worked with the baseball team. It was a pretty good Division I college baseball team, not UT. It was actually a different school that competes against UT. But anyway, and so after the presentation, the strength coach talked about having their pitchers do a lot of low intensity endurance exercise. And so after the presentation, I went up to him and I was like, okay, well, but why would you want a pitcher to do a bunch of low intensity endurance exercise? Why would you want them to do, riding the bike for 30 minutes? Why would you want them to run a bunch of poles? So if you're familiar with the baseball field, the foul poles, the big yellow poles on the right field side and the left field side, one of the types of conditioning that they would have their athletes do a lot is just to run from one pole to the other, just back and forth for long periods of time, right? And so that's that low intensity endurance exercise. And I said, well, obviously a pitcher is basically a sprint athlete, right? They're really explosive. They're going to pitch, and then they're going to have several seconds of rest, at least 20 seconds of rest, and then they're going to pitch again, and then they're going to do that, maybe 100 times. But lots of repetitive explosive activities. Why would we have them do low intensity stuff? And so the strength coach said, well, during recovery, they're going to use their aerobic system to help replenish their anaerobic system, right? So that same stuff we talked about with respect to oxygen deficit. So it's that same idea. So between pitches, they're going to use the aerobic system to make ATPs aerobically, to replenish the ones that were used anaerobically, to restore their phosphocreatine reserves, and then if they produce lactic acid, which is pretty unlikely, I mean, they're going to produce some, but for the limited lactic acid that they produce, they're also going to help with lactate turnover to get rid of that using the aerobic system. And so the coach reasoned, well, if we do a bunch of low intensity endurance exercise, we can develop their aerobic side so they can recover faster. And intuitively, that does make sense. But one of the things that the authors of this book go to great lengths to point out is that by doing a bunch of, actually, click that back, by doing a bunch of low intensity stuff, again, that can impair sprint or explosive anaerobic power performance. Because if you do low intensity endurance exercise, remember that there's a different way of recruiting the motor units. So that's my little point over here, that if we do endurance exercise, the motor unit recruitment is asynchronous versus during a sprint or power movement, it is synchronous recruitment. So there's some interference with the nervous system if we do a bunch of low intensity endurance exercise with a power athlete. So that's one problem. Another one is if we have them do like training the same muscles. So let's say we had our pitcher do like an upper body bike ergometer rather than just running. Those muscle fibers that they use will shift some to adapt to that endurance training. So that fiber type shift, rather than being type 2X, type 2A fibers, they're actually going to shift. The type 2As are going to act more like type 1s, the slow twitch fibers. The 2Xs are going to act more like 2A. So the fibers themselves then get better at producing energy aerobically, and potentially they also decrease in size. You'll get a decrease in muscle or muscle cell cross-sectional area. That's what CSA stands for. So it's a smaller muscle cell, which is good if you need to get oxygen into the cell and have it perform low intensity contractions for a long period of time, but not good if you need that muscle cell to produce lots of power. So the idea here is that even though it intuitively makes sense that and is true that a power athlete uses their aerobic system to recover between sprints or between really powerful performances like a baseball pitch, you can actually develop that system just as well or better using high intensity endurance exercise. So basically by having them do repeated sprints with rest in between, you'll still develop their aerobic side as part of their recovery from that high intensity endurance exercise. So one of the things that I would recommend, so where this baseball coach said, well, the reason, or strength coach for a baseball team said, the reason we do it is to improve their aerobic system so they can recover better. In fact, if we had them do repeated sprints, that's also going to improve their aerobic system and help them recover faster, and it's not going to cause some of that neuromuscular confusion that we get by mixing power activities with low intensity activities. So in terms of high intensity endurance exercise, they're going to categorize that or subcategorize that in a couple different ways. But broadly speaking, high intensity endurance exercise is repetitive performance of high power outputs or high velocity movements. So the example I gave you of the baseball pitcher is repetitive performance of high velocity movements. Really explosive, just a couple seconds of really explosive performance with long rest intervals in between. Or if we think about somebody like a soccer athlete, you're getting maybe 10, 40-yard sprints and then some jogging and walking in between. So you're getting a high power output, not maximal power, but high power output, and then rest intervals in between. So that's high intensity endurance exercise. So I guess one of the other ways to conceptualize this is that low intensity endurance exercise tends to be continuous. You're just going for 30 minutes, going for maybe 2 hours or more potentially. With high intensity endurance exercise, it is interval in nature. So you are increasing power, increasing velocity, taking a break, increasing power and velocity, taking a break. So it is sprint, rest, sprint, rest. So it's not continuous in the same way that low intensity endurance exercise is. And then the last point there was what I was talking about. So high intensity intervals can increase both aerobic and anaerobic exercise performance. And so we don't necessarily need to have our high intensity athletes, so our football players, baseball players, soccer players, basketball, etc. We don't necessarily need to have them do a bunch of jogging or low intensity endurance exercise. We can get the same effect in terms of aerobic recovery during rest intervals from doing repeated sprints. All right, so this is what I was talking about on the first slide. So remember, your VO2 max is the same thing as your aerobic capacity or your maximal oxygen consumption. So all three of those terms are the same. So maximal oxygen consumption, which is VO2 max, is the same thing as your aerobic capacity. And remember that your aerobic capacity really describes the ability to deliver oxygen to the muscles and the ability of the muscles to use that oxygen to reproduce ATP. So moving down a level, these three boxes, oxygen transport, maximal cardiac output, and the pulmonary system, all describe your ability to deliver oxygen. So we'll start with maximal cardiac output. That is how much blood can your heart pump per minute. And again, there are two factors to that. So cardiac output, the abbreviation for that is Q. You'll see that quite a bit, and I think even this textbook uses that. So the two factors that affect how much blood your heart can pump per minute are your maximal heart rate and then your maximal stroke volume. So your maximal heart rate, that's your pulse, that's the beats per minute of the heart. And again, that is determined based on your genetics and also based on your age. Your maximal heart rate drops with age, which you know because the maximal heart rate estimation equation is 220 minus your age, or 208 minus 0.7 times your age. But the gist of it is, from those equations, you can deduce that maximal heart rate decreases across the lifespan. So as we get older, our maximal heart rate goes down. So that's not trainable. We can't affect that. But what we can affect is our maximal stroke volume, which again is the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle with each beat. So that is something that's trainable. So with endurance training, the left ventricle gets more extensible, so you can stretch it more. It gets more elastic, so it rebounds back to its original configuration, so it snaps back to its original shape faster, more effectively, stronger. Let's go with stronger, not more stronger, but stronger there. And then it's going to have a slightly thicker wall to that left ventricle, so your heart actually gets larger, right? So it hypertrophies some, and most specifically, the left ventricle hypertrophies. And so just like with skeletal muscle, a larger muscle is a stronger muscle, so then the left ventricle of the heart is stronger, it can contract harder, it can eject more blood with each beat, which means then that we get an increase in stroke volume. Whoops, there we go. That is affected by plasma volume. So remember, your blood has two primary components. It has red blood cells and plasma. Plasma is the fluid that the red blood cells float around in. So in response to endurance training, you're going to get an increase in plasma volume. You also get a slight increase in red blood cell number, or red blood cell volume. And so by having an increase in blood volume, you get more fluid, more blood that fills up the left ventricle, which gives it more blood to pump. And so then that also increases our maximal stroke volume. After several weeks to months of training, we'll generate new red blood cells, and those red blood cells contain this protein, hemoglobin, often abbreviated capital H, lowercase b, that's hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein that actually binds to oxygen inside of the red blood cells. So we make more hemoglobin, we can transport more oxygen. Anything pulmonary deals with the lungs. So the pulmonary system deals with the lungs. One of the things to be aware of is that the lungs themselves don't adapt to training. So you don't generate new alveoli, which are the little air sacs where gas exchange, like picking up oxygen, dropping off carbon dioxide, takes place in the alveoli. You don't add new ones or add additional ones in response to training. So the lungs remain unaffected by training. So that's not something really that's trainable. So one of the things that can happen, though, is that by increasing, so at maximal exercise capacity, so like if you have a really elite athlete that's going all out, one of the things that can happen is they're turning their blood over so fast, their cardiac output is so high that they're actually circulating the blood through the lungs too fast to fully saturate, to fully fill up the red blood cells with oxygen. So you'll see an oxygen saturation rate drop from like 98% down to 96%, maybe a little bit lower than that, because they're just turning the blood over so fast. And so by having more red blood cells with hemoglobin in them, then that can kind of offset that decreased saturation rate in the pulmonary system a little bit. And then, let's see, so we talked about oxygen saturation some. So all of this then, the whole left side, the whole left 2/3 really of this deals with the ability to deliver and use oxygen. So the key takeaways here are that in response to endurance training, stroke volume goes up, so the left ventricle can eject more blood with each beat. Because stroke volume goes up, that increases cardiac output, so we can pump more blood per minute. So that's increasing cardiac output. Because we can pump more blood per minute, that blood is going to have oxygen in it and extra oxygen in response to endurance training because of that small increase in red blood cell volume. And so that then adds up to being able to deliver more oxygen to our skeletal muscle. Once we get blood and thereby oxygen to the skeletal muscle, we have to be able to use it. So in order to be able to use that oxygen, it has to diffuse into the muscle cell via the capillaries. And so one of the adaptations that we see in the muscle cell is an increase in capillary density. So you get more capillaries around an individual little muscle cell. That gives more surface area for diffusion of oxygen, so to get oxygen into the muscle cell. It also, by having greater capillary density, more capillaries per muscle cell, that gives us the ability to get rid of waste products more easily as well. So that allows that muscle fiber or muscle cell to kick out carbon dioxide, a byproduct of aerobic energy production. It also allows that muscle cell to get rid of the lactic acid that it may produce if it's working at a relatively high intensity. So capillaries function both to get oxygen into the cell, but also to take waste products away from the cell to enable it to continue to work at a high intensity. So we'll generate more capillaries around a muscle cell in response to endurance training. We will also, as discussed previously, generate more mitochondria inside of that cell. Remember, the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. That's where the aerobic energy production takes place. That's where we use oxygen to bind it to the hydrogens that we pull off of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And we use those hydrogens. Remember, we're going to create a hydrogen gradient inside of in the intermembrane matrix inside of the mitochondria, and we use that hydrogen gradient to drive resynthesis of ATP or rephosphorylation of ATP. So if we've got more mitochondria, we can make more ATP aerobically. In order to do that, we have to have more of the citric acid cycle enzymes inside of the mitochondria. And it's helpful if we have more type 1 fibers, because type 1 fibers, those are your slow twitch fibers, they tend to have more mitochondria anyway, but they're also more responsive to endurance training type stimuli where they can double or more the number of mitochondria that they had prior to training. And so the ability to, or the increase in capillary density, increases oxygen extraction, which is called the AVO2 difference. So the AVO2 difference deals with how much oxygen is in blood before it passes a muscle cell and versus how much oxygen is in blood after it passes the muscle cell. If we have more capillaries, we can, because now we have more surface area for diffusion, we can extract more oxygen, so that increases the AVO2 difference. We're more effective at extracting oxygen, getting it into the muscle cell, and then eventually getting it into the mitochondria, where we will use it to get rid of those hydrogens. So all of these adaptations, more capillaries, more mitochondria, more aerobic enzymes inside of those mitochondria, enable the muscle cell to use oxygen more effectively. So with endurance exercise then, the heart becomes more effective at delivering oxygen to the muscle cells. The muscle cells, for their part, become more effective at using the oxygen that they see, and so we get more effective at producing energy aerobically. That increases our VO2 max, and that should increase our aerobic performance, whether again that is cycling, running, swimming, etc. So those things increase our VO2 max. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because of course it's not. Now I say that, look at all those arrows. So it's more complicated than all those arrows. And that's this chart. All right, so your actual performance, how well you actually do, so that's your endurance performance, did you get first place or not, is dependent upon how fast you can actually run or swim or cycle or whatever, which is dependent upon how fast you can actually run or let's go down here. So we just talked about VO2 max. That is your ability to deliver and use oxygen. Your lactate threshold is the point at which you start to accumulate lactate. Basically, it is that you are working above, it's not the best way of conceptualizing it. you are working at such an intensity that oxygen delivery doesn't meet the demands for energy production entirely. So we're going to have to dip into the anaerobic reserves some. And so you're going to start to accumulate some lactate or lactic acid. So your lactate threshold is the point at which you start to accumulate some lactic acid. Now, if you're working just above your lactate threshold, that accumulation is going to take place pretty slowly. And so you may be able to go for an hour or longer before you hit basically the critical point of accumulation of lactate so that you have to quit because you generate too much lactate, the muscles get too acidic, etc. But if you work really far above your lactate threshold, you're going to generate lots of lactate. It's going to accumulate really quickly. When it accumulates inside of the muscle cells, that interferes with some of the glycolytic enzymes like PFK, phosphofructokinase, but that also interferes with the function of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, being able to kick calcium out. That interferes with interaction of actin and myosin. So basically, the accumulation of lactic acid inside of a muscle cell eventually will keep the muscle cell from contracting. It'll also keep the muscle cell from continuing to reproduce or to produce energy. And so then the muscle cell has to stop contracting, and so you have to stop running or doing whatever it is you were doing to generate that lactic acid. So one of the things with VO2 max, so VO2 max is expressed as a number that is relative to body size. So it is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. And so typical numbers that you're going to see for VO2 max, or I want to say typical numbers, elite athlete numbers are going to be something like 70 mLs per kg. As high as like 95 mLs per kg. And there's not a lot of athletes that have gotten it that high. Really, if you're in the 80s, that's pretty elite. But one of the things that you're going to see is that elite athletes, so with the Olympics coming up as I'm recording this, elite athletes are going to have pretty similar VO2 maxes. But some of them are going to have higher performances than others, obviously. So aerobic capacity itself, the ability to deliver and use oxygen itself, is not the entire story for actual endurance performance. It also depends on at what percentage of your VO2 max is your lactate threshold. So can you operate at 80% of your VO2 max before you hit your lactate threshold, before lactate starts to accumulate? Or can you operate at 88% of your VO2 max before lactate starts to accumulate? So that is what we're talking about with the performance VO2. It's basically at what percentage of your VO2 max does lactate start to accumulate? Because if you've got two people that both have a VO2 max of 80, but one person has a lactate threshold that is 70% of their VO2 max of 80, and another person has a lactate threshold that is 80% of their VO2 max at 80, the person with the higher lactate threshold can work at a higher intensity. They can run faster, swim faster, cycle faster before they start to accumulate lactate, which means then, they have an increased performance VO2, which means that they can run faster or swim faster, etc., which means they're probably going to do better, right? They're going to place higher than the person with the aerobic capacity, the lactate threshold that's at a lower percentage of their aerobic capacity. Lactate threshold power velocity is just how fast are you running, cycling, or swimming before you are actually accumulating lactic acid. So that is related to movement economy. So movement economy deals with how efficient you are. So usually you'll see it referred to, or I'm most familiar with the concept of running economy, which is how much oxygen do you use to run at a given speed. So if somebody is a really economical runner, let's go back to the two athlete example. You've got two athletes running at 8 miles an hour. And so one athlete is using 40 mLs per kg, the other athlete is using 50 mLs per kg to run at that speed. The athlete that's using less oxygen is the athlete that's more efficient. They're using less oxygen because they're having to produce less energy, which means that they are using the ATP that they're producing more efficiently. So the higher your movement economy, the less energy you need to use to run at a given speed. So more economical runners are more efficient runners or swimmers, right? So this relates to things like swimming as well. An inefficient swimmer is going to be one that is not very hydrodynamic. So like they have a lot of drag, they have a lot of extraneous movement. And you see this with other endurance sports too. Like they just, you see it in runners who like their arms come out to their sides, or they have a lot of like hip rotation as they run, or a lot of extra ankle dorsiflexion as they run. Those kinds of things, hip drop as they run. Those kinds of things require extra energy to correct. So going back to hip drop, you have to get a stronger contraction of the glutes to balance the pelvis back out. That's just extra energy that you had to use, and so that makes you a less efficient, less economical runner. You're burning more energy, so you're probably going to get tired faster. Other things, so I won't really get into this stuff too much. People that have a higher proportion of type 1 fibers tend to be more economical. One of the reasons for that, and I think the reason I'm talking about is because I think it's fascinating. So your type 1 fibers are your slow twitch fibers. Slow twitch means that relative to the fast twitch, it takes them longer to reach peak tension. So I think the example I use in 201 is that the 2X fibers reach peak tension, there we go, in 50 milliseconds for the fast twitch, in 5 milliseconds for the fast twitch fibers, and then the slow twitch fibers, it's 50 milliseconds, right? So it takes them 10 times as long to generate peak tension. And then when they do it, the type 1 fibers, not only does it take them much, much longer to generate peak tension, but they generate half or less the amount of tension as the type 2X fibers. But one of the good things is, one of the trade-offs is, even though it takes them a long time to develop peak tension, they also let go really slowly. So there's a longer interaction of actin and myosin. And so then that enables you to be a little bit more economical, because that enables essentially a stronger eccentric part of the motion. And so that's kind of a trade-off there. So that it enables a little bit more economical running or economical cycling performance because of that sort of longer eccentric part of the motion. And we kind of talked about these things. So lactate threshold depends upon skeletal muscle function. So how effective are your skeletal muscles at generating energy aerobically? So that's a lot of those same adaptations that we talked about. So how many mitochondria do you have? How many capillaries do you have? How many aerobic enzymes do you have? All of those kind of things. So the same things that affect VO2 max, a lot of the same things that affect VO2 max, affect lactate threshold when we're talking about the adaptations that we make in the skeletal muscle. All right. So factors that affect anaerobic endurance performance. So again, this is repeated sprint type performance. So the first is bioenergetics. So in response to repeated sprint type training, so having athletes run repeated hundreds with, 30 seconds or more of rest in between, in response to that type of training, you're going to see that the trained muscle cells have increased substrates. So remember, substrates are exercise fuels. So they'll have more ATP, more phosphocreatine, and more glycogen inside of those trained muscle cells, as well as the enzymes that are going to help break them down. So you'll have more creatine kinase, you'll have more of the glycolytic enzymes, you'll have more of the ATPases that are going to break it down as well. You're also going to get better at buffering lactic acid and better at lactic acid disposal as well. So we won't really get into buffering capacity, but because that gets really complicated, but just take my word for it. You get better at buffering the lactic acid that you produce with that repeated sprint performance. You get improved performance of the cardiovascular system, so increased VO2 max, increased stroke volume, and then increased ability to use the oxidative metabolism rest, which is what I talked about earlier, that you get better at engaging the oxidative system, the aerobic system during recovery to restore ATP, to restore the phosphocreatine reserves, and then to get rid of lactic acid. And then the neuromuscular system, so again, key point that the author stressed, high intensity endurance exercise doesn't seem to disrupt motor unit recruitment in the same way that low intensity does. All right, so if we want to develop endurance, So basically there are several different training intensities, or paces is another way of thinking about these, that you can train at to try to produce different effects. So one training intensity or training pace is referred to as long, slow distance training. In Jack Daniels' book, he refers to it as easy pace. And so long, slow distance training, or easy pace, is a pace that you can maintain for 30 minutes to 2 hours or longer. So again, this is kind of if you're going to go out for a leisurely ride, if you're going to go out for a leisurely run, that kind of thing. That is your long, slow distance training. That forms your training base. You're going to get some of the adaptations that I talked about. So you'll see some improvements in stroke volume. You'll see some improvements in plasma volume, red blood cell volume, capillary density, mitochondrial density, etc. But one of the things here, so you can see that you're only operating at between 66-65% of your heart rate max and 80%. So think back to the chart I showed you last time where it had the cutoffs at 50% of your VO2 max. You're using only type 1 fibers, between 50 and 75%, and these are ballparks, that's not an exact cutoff, but between 50 and 75%, now you're getting into your type 2As, above 75%, now you're into your type 2Xs, but not many of them. So the gist of it is, with that long, slow distance training, you're going to make those adaptations in the muscle cells, so more mitochondria, more capillaries, etc., but only in the type 1 fibers and only in the type 2As, really. So during a race, so if you go out for leisurely runs all the time and then you decided to do a 10K race, well, you're probably going to want to do well, and so you're going to run fast. You don't want to let that guy beat you or that lady beat you, and so you're going to run faster, right? And so in doing that, you're probably going to be working at a higher intensity than you're used to training. So you're going to be engaging those type 2 fibers, type 2Xs more specifically, but you won't have trained those fibers. So they won't have made those same adaptations. They won't have more mitochondria. They won't have more capillary density. So they're going to generate lots of lactate. You're going to accumulate lactate, and then you're going to be uncomfortable and you're going to have to stop or at least slow down. So with this low intensity stuff, again, we're going to use this as a training base. So we're going to have our athlete do this a lot in the general preparatory phase to develop that aerobic base, and then we're going to build on that base by doing higher intensity stuff. So long, slow distance training, we see they can do it for long distances, hence the name, right? So they can do like long runs on Sunday, and you see this especially with like marathoners, where they'll go out and they'll run 20 miles on Sunday. But you also see this same pace, the long, slow distance pace or the easy pace, between work days. So remember that we talked about that typically you're only going to have 2 to 3 hard or 2 to 3 quality days per microcycle. And so on the days between, on the recovery days, you're not going to be, the athlete won't be doing nothing. They'll probably be going for like a 30-minute run or a 45-minute run. And the pace of that run is going to be this pace. So this pace then is what they use for recovery days. It's also what they're going to use between intervals. So if they're doing tempo training, where they're running at a fairly high intensity for 10 or 20 minutes, and then they're running at a recovery pace for more like 10 minutes between, they're going to be closer to this long, slow distance intensity, and maybe even a little bit lower, but somewhere kind of in this neighborhood. Interval training. So interval training broadly just means periods of work interspersed with periods of rest, right? So typically you're going to be working above your lactate threshold, and how far above your lactate threshold determines whether you're doing aerobic intervals or anaerobic intervals. So throwing back to the Jack Daniels book, and most of his stuff's on the internet. It's pretty easy to find if you just Google Jack Daniels running formula. But and I say that because that's what I'm most familiar with, but the basic system in this book is really similar. But one of the paces that he talks about is kind of this tempo pace, which is would count under aerobic intervals. And so there, you're going to do something like a 10-minute interval, maybe as long as 20-minute interval, at a pretty hard intensity. So it is uncomfortable and faster than you would otherwise run if you just kind of go out for a leisurely run. But it's not something that is super uncomfortable or super unsustainable. So typically they do that for 10 to 20 minutes. They'll take a break, get their heart rate down, in this case under 130, for 10 minutes, and then they'll come back up and do it again. So that's tempo type training. And so what you're doing there, as you can see, is you're stressing the aerobic energy system because you're working at or slightly above your lactate threshold. And so because we're working at those higher intensities, we're going to generate some lactate or some lactic acid. And then when we work at those lower intensities, then what we do is inside of those muscle cells that have generated a bunch of lactic acid, they're going to use their additional capillaries that they formed during our training base to shuttle the lactic acid out of them. That lactic acid then goes into the bloodstream, circulates to other fibers that are resting, or even to the heart. The heart's actually really good at disposing of lactic acid, where we will turn that lactic acid back into pyruvate, and then we'll send it through the citric acid cycle inside of a mitochondria, and then dispose of it that way. So during those rest intervals, if you will, or rest phases between the work intervals, that's when you're going to dispose of that lactic acid. And so these aerobic intervals, you're going to generate some and then you're going to get rid of it. You're going to generate some and then you're going to get rid of it. So that's the idea there. It helps us with lactate turnover. Here's a slightly different setup. So with this one, 80-85% of your max heart rate. You're going to run for 5 minutes in that zone, and then for 1 minute, you're going to be more at like that easy pace or that long, slow distance pace, and then you're going to go back up here. So with these are a little bit higher intensity than what I was just showing you on the last one, hence a 5-minute work duration as opposed to a 10-minute work duration. And so these are going to generate a little bit more lactate or lactic acid. So just a slightly higher intensity with a little bit shorter work interval. Anaerobic intervals. So now we're stressing the anaerobic system, so we're running faster. So shorter than 2 minutes of duration. Could be all out, doesn't have to be. But one of the ways to do it, so this is kind of one of the recommendations. So you do 4 to 10 sets of 15 to 30 seconds with somewhere between 45 seconds to 12 minutes of recovery in between. And the length of that recovery depends on numerous factors. One is, do you want to stress mostly the ATP phosphocreatine system? If so, you want longer rest intervals. If you want them to generate more lactic acid, well, now you want shorter rest intervals. So you could do like 15 to 45, because that's a 1 to 3 work rest ratio. And so they're going to, over the course of 4 to 10 sets of that, they're going to generate a pretty good amount of lactic acid. And so by doing those higher intensity things, the faster you're running or swimming or cycling or whatever, working at those higher intensities, you are going to cause a higher cardiac output. By causing a higher cardiac output, well, one of the ways you cause that is you actually get increased venous return, so blood coming back to the heart from those repetitive muscle contractions. That increased volume of blood coming back to the heart, which again is called venous return, is actually going to stretch the heart out a little bit. So that's one of the things that causes that increased extensibility of the left ventricle in response to endurance exercise, is that increased venous return. And so with these higher intensity things, that will help increase stroke volume, which helps increase VO2 max, which helps then improve endurance performance. So this is the idea where, or this is that idea of you can do high intensity stuff to improve your aerobic system, to improve that aerobic recovery between sprints. So going back to my original example, that's what I'm getting at, of the baseball pitcher. The reason I would have them do a bunch of like 15 and 30 second sprints with 45 seconds of rest or 90 seconds of rest in between is I'm trying to improve their cardiac output. By improving their cardiac output, I'm improving their aerobic capacity. By improving their aerobic capacity, I'm improving their ability to recover between work bouts. So I'm improving their ability to restore ATP, restore phosphocreatine aerobically, and then also to get rid of lactate aerobically. So we can use this rather than low intensity endurance exercise with our higher intensity athletes like baseball players, soccer players, etc. Fartlek training is it's training with a funny name. It is a type of interval training, but it is not as exact as the ones I just showed you, where it's like 15 seconds of work, 45 seconds of rest, go, go, go. Maybe you got a timer, you got something beeping at you to let you know work, rest. Fartlek training, as you can see, that it's a Swedish word which means speed play. It is basically the athlete runs, they're out for a run one day and they run a little bit faster until they get uncomfortable or whatever the goal is, and then they slow down until they feel like they've recovered. And then they speed up and slow down and speed up and slow down. And so as you can see, you can do it with hills, or you can just do it on a flat roadway, for example, by just speeding up. But this one is much more based on feel. So it is when they feel recovered, they speed up again, and they speed up until they feel fatigued, and then they slow down. And so it's not that exact to the second work-rest ratio. It is much more about how the athlete feels about it. So here's a sample training plan for a 10K runner, and you can kind of see what I was talking about in terms of the quality days. So Monday's a rest day for whatever reason. Tuesday's a quality day, so they're going to do 30 seconds of rest, 60 seconds of recovery. They're going to do that 6 times, 1-to-2 work-rest ratio, as hard as they can go. We're just going to do a fairly easy run on Wednesday to recover. So again, that's that long, slow distance pace. Another long, slow distance pace day. Again, these two in general are pretty synonymous as far as paces go, but they're going to go longer, so they're going to go 2 hours here. Quality day here, higher intensity, same quality day as we saw on Tuesday, and then we're going to do another slower pace day, and then just how they feel on Sunday. So the two genuine quality days are Tuesday and Friday, and potentially you could probably count Sunday as a quality day as well. All right, so as far as training for power-based sports, so they fall into 2 categories. So you've got these brief intermittent tasks where you've got these really big power outputs but really long rest intervals. So the sports that fall into this classification include things like football, baseball, softball. So think about football play. The play itself is only give or take 6 seconds, and you may be able to rest as long as 60 seconds in between. So you've got a pretty low work-rest ratio there. So you don't work for very long. It's very intense, but you don't work for very long, and you have pretty lengthy rest intervals in between. Same thing with baseball. You're either throwing a pitch with 20-30 seconds of rest, and those are the more repeated effort athletes, or you're a center fielder and you do a sprint real quick to catch a ball, you throw the ball, maybe you have a couple other sprints in the outfield toward balls that were hit relatively close to you, but for the most part, there's a lot of resting going on there. And then a similar thing with softball. They're going to cover shorter distances, but they're probably going to move around a little bit more frequently because of the smaller field dimensions. So, and I say that not knowing a huge amount about softball, but that seems reasonable to me. Anyway, so they're going to use the ATP phosphocreatine system, and then they're going to use the aerobic system to recover in between. Then we have our interval sprint athletes, like our soccer players, basketball, lacrosse, rugby. So they're going to use ATP phosphocreatine during sprints, and then glycolytic system during longer sprints, or if they've got a couple sprints back to back before they're able to have a complete recovery, they're going to generate some lactic acid as well, and then they're going to use the oxidative system while they're jogging or walking to get rid of the lactic acid or to rephosphorylate ATP and phosphocreatine. And again, for these athletes, for both of these sets of athletes, we do more repeated sprint training rather than low-intensity endurance exercise to facilitate recovery. As you move from general preparatory phase to the specific preparatory phase, we want the work-rest ratio to be similar to what is dictated by the sport. So for example, in soccer, typical work-rest ratios are somewhere between 1-7 or 1-8. So they'll sprint for 10 seconds and then rest for 80 or something to that effect. That would be something that would mimic the energetic demands of the sport. One of the things to be careful about with high intensity endurance exercise, and even, you see a lot about, I was watching a presentation the other day about high intensity interval training and how useful it is, and it is, but you have to be careful with it. You can't do it every single day because then that tends to lead to overtraining. So typically with that high intensity endurance exercise, you can perform that 1 to 2 days a week, which is what was happening on that 10K training program I was showing you a minute ago, where they had the 2 days where they were doing 30-second sprint, 60-second rest, and they had 2 of those days. So only 2 days in that program of high intensity endurance exercise. So don't go overboard, I guess, is the important point here. This is a really useful table, table 11.9, that has your work-rest ratios and then which energy systems you're going to use. So if we're working for 2 to 8 seconds, so these are all-out sprints. If we want to stress the ATP phosphocreatine system, we want pretty long rest times. So somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe as long as 4 minutes here. And then if we're going to go the glycolytic system, or if we're going to go, let's go with that. If we're going to go with the glycolytic system, slightly longer work intervals and a little bit shorter rest intervals. And then we can go a little bit longer here. And then the further down we get, once we get to this last row, then now we're going to be stressing the oxidative system. So we're going to have these really long work periods, more than 3 minutes, and then pretty long recoveries. So these, you tend to see more like a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio for the aerobic system. You tend to see longer recoveries for the anaerobic stuff. So these 6 zones, these are kind of like what I was describing to you with the Jack Daniels book. The idea is that some days of the week you do your long, slow distance training, and then you do that as recovery between intervals, and then other days you do tempo runs, or other days you do what he calls rep training, but that would be this alactic system or lactic training to work on things like running economy, that sort of thing. So these are the different zones they could work at. One of the things that frustrated me a little bit is they don't all have corresponding heart rates, because you can give somebody, say, okay, work at a certain percentage of their VO2 max, but for most of our athletes, we don't necessarily do VO2 maxes on them, so heart rate max is probably the most accessible piece of information they can get, because heart rate monitors are pretty cheap, they're easy to use, so I wish they had heart rate max correlations here, but they don't. So anyway, there's 6 zones that they give. Zone 1's the highest intensity. Zone 6 is the lowest intensity. So zone 1 is your sprints, so 2 to 8 seconds, so high intensities. Pretty long recoveries, so they even have as long as, or for this particular training zone here, they've got as long as 13 minutes of recovery. You would do that if you wanted really high quality repetition. So you really want them to go as fast as possible and to make sure that they're recovered between. Then you want something like that really long, 12, 13 minute rest between, because that allows for the restoration, not only of the ATP system, but also the creatine phosphate. Zone 2, a little bit less intense, a little bit longer work intervals, so more like 15 to 90 seconds, and then the rest will be 3 or 5 times whatever the work is. So this is similar to what I was describing to you on the last one, so we don't want to do that any more than 2 times a week, because they're going to generate pretty significant lactic acid with this type of training, and so if you do it too often, you can run into problems with overtraining. So the idea here is to get them to be used to being uncomfortable. So that might be something that's useful for like a basketball player, kind of a fourth quarter or late second half kind of a thing, to get them used to generating lots of lactate and being able to tolerate the discomfort that goes with that. It's also useful for our athletes that are more endurance type athletes that are, sprinting to the finish kind of a thing, where it's going to be, you're already generating a ton of lactate and now you're going to go all in and be really, really uncomfortable for the last, 100, 200 meters to the finish line. This type of training will help them prepare for that, zone 2. Zone 3, fairly high intensity. There you can see that they're operating between 95 and 100% of their maximum heart rate, relatively short intervals, so 1 to 6 minutes. The idea here, again, is with that high intensity where you're operating at 100% of your max heart rate, that you're going to increase venous return and hopefully increase stroke volume, which thereby increases your cardiac output. Anaerobic threshold training, you're working just above your lactate threshold. Talked about this a similar concept to this a little while ago. The idea that we're going to work just above the lactate threshold, generate some lactate, and then we're going to rest to shuttle it back out. So the idea with this type of training is that it helps you, and actually zone 2 training, really all of 2, 3, 4, help you improve your lactate threshold. So help you turn over lactate, shuttle it out of the muscle cell, shuttle it to cells that aren't working at as high of an intensity, and then get rid of it. Zone 5 is more like kind of that long, slow distance pace. It's a little bit faster than that, but not much. So it is something that can be used for base training, and then their aerobic compensation training. They have acronyms for all of them. COT. Okay. Anyway, so they're going to use, the way this is laid out here, they're using that as kind of that long, slow pace or that recovery pace between work intervals. And this is also the warm-up and the cool-down pace as well. In terms of what that's going to look like with an annual plan, so you can see there, so we're going to be doing a lot of like aerobic base training here, so long, slow distance type pace or COT pace here. And then one of the things we'll have them do is to do tempo training, so work just above their lactate threshold So we're working on building the aerobic base, and then we're working on a little bit of lactate turnover. Then we're going to start working on improving their aerobic capacity, and then lactate tolerance, and then we'll work on more specific to their sport, and then we're just going to work at fairly high intensities to maintain through here. So that's it. So that's it for endurance training. We'll move on next time to the last chapter, which is agility training. So we will see you for that.